Okay, I think we can start. I'm Robert Hutchings. I'm Diplomat in residence here at the Woodrow Wilson School. Welcome. This is the first of several. We don't know exactly how many sessions we're going to do over the next months on the phenomenon of anti-American around the world. How to understand it, what to do about it, how we should think about it, how worried we should be about it. We're starting in Europe because there's studies of the most dramatic, at least the most dramatic shift in attitudes, largely surrounding the Iraq War, the decision to invade Iraq, and the breakdown of transatlantic consensus over such a seminal foreign policy decision. There's been some wonderful work done, and we have three panelists here who are ideally suited to help us understand these phenomena in Europe. Richard Wike, associated with the Pew Global Attitudes Project, will be our first presenter. Pew has done some really important work over the last several years, helping us understand and track the phenomenon of anti-Americanism. One of the sub-themes that has developed is that there are some trends that we ought to worry about because rather than just a repetition of the cyclical opposition to particular policies or particular leaders, there seems to be, in Pew's data, something deeper at work here, some shifts in attitudes toward America and Americans more generally. How durable that is, I think one could debate, and I think that probably will be a topic of discussion in the panel. John Glenn, representing the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Trends document. This is a very recent study of exploring European and American foreign policy attitudes sort of more broadly. It's a very helpful study. It comes at a particularly useful time because we have new leaders in key European countries, seemingly representing some foreign policy departures. First, Angela Merkel in Germany, heading a rather cumbersome grand coalition. Nicolas Sarkozy in France and Gordon Brown in the UK, among other European leaders, but the three major European leaders of all our countries have all changed leaders in the last year or so. On our side, I think we are now already beginning a new phase in our engagement in Iraq. It's not publicly announced yet, but we are sort of moving into a new phase. A new set of policies may have to await the presidential election, but that's coming up in about a year's time. So we too are in a period of flux. So it's a good time for stock taking of the transatlantic relationship to examine these emerging attitudes on both sides of the Atlantic, how durable they are. And I hope toward the end of our conversation we will touch on the question of what do we do about all this? Rather than wring our hands and worry about it, and maybe lament what's been done in the past, what do we do to address worrying trends in transatlantic relationships more generally? I would put it even more broadly as how and whether the transatlantic relationship, which has already established itself as the most durable alliance in human history, whether this alliance can transform itself, can adapt itself to be as relevant to the 21st century as it was to the last half of the 20th century. I don't think the answer to that question is obvious, which is why I posed it, and I hope we will get to it toward the end of our conversation. But first, let me turn the floor over to Richard Wike. I'm sorry, I didn't mention my colleague Sophie Meunier, who's done some wonderful work on not only on lots of things European, but on French attitudes in particular, which is sadly talk about transatlantic trends and the German Marshall Fund. Sophie will offer some really in-depth and insightful comments about French attitudes. She has probably more than any other single person sort of plumbed recent French attitudes, sometimes in a way that causes controversy, at least in France, sometimes over here, but some really wonderful articles in Foreign Affairs. She is now working on a book on anti-Americanism in France, but this is a topic of an article that she did 2 years ago in the journal French Politics, Culture, and Society called Anti-Americanisms, plural, in France. She also did a very well-received article called The French Exception in Foreign Affairs a few years ago. She is author of, with Gordon, co-author of The French Challenge, Adapting to Globalization and of Trading Voices, EU and International Commercial Negotiations, now available in paperback. Too late for a beach reading, but just in time for Christmas giving. So, I heard on Sophie Meunier will pull that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really happy to be here and to be a part of this panel and part of this discussion. What I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the key findings that we've had at the Pew Global Attitude Project over the last few years regarding attitudes towards the U.S. and Europe. And most of the data that I want to draw on today comes from a survey we did this spring in 47 countries, including 6 Western European countries and 6 Eastern European countries, although I'll pull in some data from some other surveys as well. And I really want to do 3 things. I want to show you, first of all, some general trends on attitudes towards the U.S. and towards Americans. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that might be driving attitudes towards the U.S. and driving a lot of the negative views that we see around the world. And then I just want to conclude with a few ideas about what all this might mean, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that in our discussion period as well. So, I think the basic story is probably pretty familiar to all of you. We've seen a declining views of the U.S. in much of the world over the last 5 years, and it's particularly true in Europe. There are places in the world that do remain pretty positive about America, around much of Africa, India, Japan. There are pockets where we really haven't seen this dip in favorable attitudes towards the U.S. But the overall pattern in the last few years has been a downward trend, and that's been particularly clear if you look at attitudes in Europe. And there are a lot of things, obviously, that go into influencing how people feel about America. There's certainly a long sort of intellectual tradition on both the right and left in Europe, for example, of anti-Americanism. But if you want to explain this most recent dip, you certainly have to look at attitudes about U.S. foreign policy, and I'll show you some data on that. First of all, I wanted to put the findings from Europe in a little bit of a global context. This is some data on our very sort of basic measure of how people feel about the U.S. We asked respondents, do you have a favorable or an unfavorable attitude of the United States? And here I've just presented a regional median, which is a very crude measure, but I just want to present it to you to give you a rough idea of how various regions of the world stack up on this. And as you can see, the U.S. does pretty well in Africa, broadly popular throughout most of sub-Saharan Africa. Attitudes towards the U.S. have been trending down generally in Latin America, but still on balance are positive. A little less so in Eastern Europe. Even less so in Asia. And then you see Western Europe, which is, only the Middle East actually has a lower overall U.S. favorability rating than we find in Western Europe among many of our key allies. So this just gives you a little bit of a sense of how, according to the data we've gotten from our most recent survey in spring of this year, how attitudes in Europe are stacked up globally. And here are the country-by-country numbers in Western Europe, going back to the beginning of this decade. And here you can see a pretty clear pattern. In 2000, the numbers are pretty high generally. About 2002, they're starting to dip. And in 2003 and 2004, you really see the bottom fall out around the time of the onset of the Iraq War. And since then, we really haven't seen the numbers come back. In a few places, they do continue to plunge a bit. In Germany, over the last year, we've seen yet another dip in the number of people saying they have a attitude towards the U.S. Here's the same set of data, except for Eastern Europe. And a couple things are notable here. Number one, overall, you do have more positive attitudes towards the U.S. in Eastern Europe than you do in Western Europe. At the same time, you do see this stark fall off, a big decline in the last 5 years in many places. Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, large declines since 2002 in terms of the number of people who say they have a favorable attitude of the United States. So, to use Rumsfeld's terms, New Europe is starting to look a lot more like old Europe in terms of how they feel about the United States. And then also put Turkey on here. only 9% of Turks said they have a favorable attitude towards the United States, which is the lowest of all the 47 countries included in our most recent survey. So it's the only one in single digits, which is pretty startling to a lot of people given that they've been a NATO ally for decades. So, very low levels of positive opinion about the U.S. and Turkey. Now, here's some data on the same type of question, a basic favorability measure, but about the American people rather than the United States as a country. And, a couple things to point out about this slide. First of all, overall, you'll see that attitudes towards the American people tend to be much more positive in Europe than about the U.S. as a country. And this is a pattern you see all over the world. It's particularly true. There's a particularly large gap in Europe. But the second thing you'll see is that, again, we have seen a decline over the last 5 years. Significant drops in favorable attitudes towards Americans in Britain, Italy, France, and double-digit declines throughout Eastern Europe. So I think this does suggest some deepening of negative sentiments about the United States. So, what's driving these attitudes? Well, like I said, a lot of it certainly is tied to views of American foreign policy. It's Iraq. We all know that the Iraq War is unpopular internationally. But it's other things as well. It's this perception, for instance, that the U.S. acts unilaterally on the world stage. Of course, it's tied to Iraq, but I think it's broader than Iraq. We ask the question, does the United States take into account, or how much does the United States take into account the interests of countries like yours when it's making foreign policy decisions? And these numbers represent the number of people who say not too much or not much at all. And as you can see, the number of people saying that the United States really doesn't take into account their interests, has gone up dramatically over the last 5 years in many places. And these numbers overall are very high. Huge increases in Germany, Britain, France, three long-term key allies of the United States who are saying that the U.S. really doesn't take into account their interests. Similarly, we've seen a big decline in support for the war on terror across the board in Europe and elsewhere as well. You rarely see these kind of changes really in public opinion data, but 32-point decline in support for the U.S.-led war on terror in France. It's down over 30 points in Britain and Ukraine, and consistently down over more than 20 points in all the countries that we showed here. And, in part, the war on terror has been increasingly defined by Iraq. It's things like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. And overall, both in Europe and throughout the world, we're seeing less and less support for the U.S.-led war on terror. Of course, in the U.S., there's been a lot of discussion in the last 6 months or so about how to frame the war on terror. There's been debate about that term in the presidential race. So I think this is something we'll be hearing more and more about. And it's certainly something that draws a very sort of negative reaction much in Europe. Now, there are things that people continue to like about the United States, and I think that's important to keep in mind. For instance, in Europe and really throughout the world, people continue to admire U.S. Scientific and technological achievements. And you can see that reflected here. Again, these are just sort of regional, median, just very crude measures to give you a sense of how various regions of the world stack up on these matters. There's widespread admiration for U.S. science and technology. Here, the number of people who say they like U.S. pop culture, American movies and TV and music. And again, you have some exceptions, but it tends to be generally pretty popular, particularly in Europe. So there are a lot of European intellectuals who don't like American popular culture, but the European people actually kind of like it and tell us that they like that feature of American culture. At the same time, there are a lot of worries about what you might think of as Americanization. We ask people whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that American ideas and customs are spreading to their country. And here are the number of people telling us that's a good thing. And as you can see, it's pretty low. Even in Africa, where we're very popular, pretty low numbers, less than half generally. So, I think this reflects a sort of push-pull, love-hate relationship a lot of people have about America. They do like our popular culture. At the same time, they have certain worries about losing their own traditions, their own culture. And I think this question kind of picks up those concerns. Maybe there's a little bit too much America in the lives of some people in different countries. So I think that's what the question reflects. Now, I just wanted to conclude with a few other points to sort of put this data in context. Our first report that we put out this year on the 2007 survey was called Global Unease with Major World Powers. Because what we saw in the data was that it's true that there are a lot of negative views about the U.S. and much of the world, but it's also true that there are a lot of negative views about the other major powers, major contenders in the world as well, particularly regarding China and Russia, and particularly in Europe. We've seen real drop-offs in terms of favorable views of both China and Russia in Europe over the last couple of years. And if you look at attitudes towards Chavez or Ahmadinejad, these sort of more fiery challengers to the global status quo, attitudes towards both of them tend to be pretty negative in most of the world as well. So I think it's important to sort of put the findings about America in context of global public opinion, which says there's a lot of unease about major powers in general. Second point I wanted to make is that that there probably will be some sort of honeymoon, maybe in 2009. Certainly, a lot of the views that we see and documented here, a lot of the negative views that we see about America are linked to the Bush administration. They are linked to foreign policy. But it's also worth keeping in mind that there's some sort of more structural, long-term issues, I think, that are going to pose challenges for the next administration. Are going to keep being issues as far as how Europeans view America. There are these concerns about Americanization that we talked about. There's some general fears about American power, preponderance of American power in the world. And we asked a question about whether or not people would like to see another power rival the United States. And in theory, at least, a lot of people tell us they want to see that. There are differences over things like the use of military force and when that is appropriate in world affairs between Americans and Europeans. And another thing I think is important is the environment. This most recent survey we conducted suggested that concerns about the environment are up all over the globe, really, in all sorts of different regions, including in Europe. We also asked people, well, whose fault is it really? Who's most to blame for the environmental problems that we see in the world? And, probably unsurprisingly, they tell us it's mostly the United States, or the United States deserves more of the blame for environmental problems than other countries. So I think people's concerns about the environment and America's role in environmental issues is something that is a long-term structural issue as well. And then I'll just close with one other thing, which, as we tend to do a lot of times when we're doing these presentations on attitudes towards the U.S., I focus a lot on bad news. I think there is some good news, and it is important to keep in mind that there are a lot of shared values and shared concerns between Europeans and Americans. And that does sort of give you hope that some of these numbers might turn around. And there's certainly been highs and lows in terms of attitudes towards the U.S. At times in the past in Europe. I think the question now is, compared to something like maybe the 80s during the Reagan administration or some period like that, about this sort of overall, overarching structure of the Cold War, is there still that sort of unifying, some unifying structures that can bring Americans and Europeans together and maybe turn around some of these numbers that we see here. And with that, I'll stop and happy to talk more about data. Okay. Thank you.
Let me start by actually expressing my sincere delight in being here. It's a lot of fun to be on a panel with Richard and Sophie, both of whom I know, and to be here in Princeton with you today. I think that this is a really interesting topic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say as well. A lot of what I'm going to draw on today is a survey called Transatlantic Trends, which is the German Marshall Fund has been doing with the Compagnie di San Paolo, an Italian organization, since 2002. All of the data is available on www.transatlantictrends.org. So I'm going to give you just a couple of things relevant to the anti-Americanism discussion. But if this catches your eye, please check out the website. The top line data is there, as well as our key findings report. So let me begin by saying I came out of the academic world, and I work in the policy field these days. So most of the work that we do on this survey is concerned with how likely it is the United States and its European allies are to find for support for common policies or common approaches to looking at global challenges today. Now, in my mind, anti-Americanism, if we want to take that concept seriously, I think really should refer to something much broader than a disagreement with our policies. Something presumably more enduring than that, maybe a set of feelings or a set of attitudes that are independent of views towards U.S. policies. Anti-Americanism might be considered, I think, along with broader views of prejudice such as racism and anti-Semitism. These are broader, enduring policies and values. And my background is with a PhD in sociology, in which there's an extensive literature on racism and race relations, minority relations, and discrimination. So tonight, for our discussion, what I'd like to propose, though, is that what we're seeing is less anti-Americanism than strong disagreement with current U.S. policies. Now, the notion of anti-Americanism in Europe, as Richard suggested, and Sophie's done some very neat work on, has a long history of debates and theories about where it comes from. But these days, the discussion really takes place, as we talked about earlier, in view of a spike of negative views of the United States surrounding the war in Iraq and the re-election of President Bush in 2004. So let me really quick show you a little bit of data that brings that to the table from our survey. The first one is, this is the classic sort of chart you'll see, which people point to, the reversal of views towards the United States. The question here was, how desirable is it that the U.S. exerts strong global leadership? And you'll see on the far left in 2002, the positive views were at 64. They declined in 2003, hit the bottom at 36 in 2004, where they largely stay the same this year at 36% of Europeans who say that U.S. global leadership is desirable. The negative views start at 31 and reverse in a very clear pattern. So if you look at these numbers, you say, wow, look at what's happened to the views of the United States. Is this anti-Americanism? And it's clear that the image of the United States has taken a serious hit. But if we continue and we compare those views of desirability of U.S. leadership with approval of President Bush's handling of his international policies, I think we see an interesting portrait. Those are the figures you see in Europe for that. In Europe, those figures begin in 2002 at a not especially high 38%. They also drop in 2003 and hit in 2004 at about 20%, at which point, given our margin of error, they stay largely the same. What this slide does for me is it shows me two things. The first is the commonality of the pattern of these lines. It suggests to me that views of the United States more generally are strongly influenced by views of the policies of its president. This seems only sensible to me. But that they are not identical. There is a persistent, almost 20 percentage point gap throughout the past 6 years between views of the U.S. more generally and views of President Bush. If those numbers, let me be clear, if those lines were to come together, I would conclude that anti-Bush sentiment had become anti-Americanism. But the fact that they have maintained this gap between them suggests to me that many Europeans, at least, continue to distinguish their feelings towards the United States more generally and the feelings towards the policies of President Bush. Now, indeed, I think that these figures are powerful. But this is what I'm going to use to suggest to you before. I'll give you a little bit more data in a moment, that what we're seeing is strong disagreement with our policies. Now, there are many out there who argue that what we're seeing is anti-Americanism. The Pew Research Center has done some really provocative work on this. And if you've not checked out the book by Andrew Kohut and Bruce Stokes called America Against the World, please let me recommend it to you. It's extremely interesting, well-written, and offers a lot of really powerful arguments. Most of these are assertions about values and differences to explain anti-Americanism. So we're different, and they dislike us, Americans, because of those differences. So you'll hear this tends to run along the lines of, we're too religious, whereas they are more secular. Ireland and Poland aside, of course. We believe in the use of force. They believe in negotiations, despite polling figures on France that show that our attitudes actually aren't so different on this issue. We're more individualistic, where they're more collectivist, of course, setting aside the Brits. We believe in risk in the free market, and they believe in security and the welfare state. These are the kinds of things you tend to hear to invoke these values differences, which is why we are different and why there is anti-American. Now, Richard pointed out, obviously we want to take a historical perspective on this, but this is something I think actually fairly poorly served by public opinion polls. I mean, public opinion is much better, I think, at evaluating smaller rather than larger, more complex changes. And it provides information, I think, for how people can evaluate theories or decisions. But it rarely can it tell the future, or can it explain why something has happened. So let me sort of give you, however, in closing, two sort of contrary views. Maybe two reasons why I think these differences will endure, and two reasons why I think they won't. The first reasons why they'll endure is I think that negative views towards the United States are, in significant part, linked to the status of the United States as the dominant military and economic player in the world, and we should expect that to continue in some form in the coming years. There is no rival superpower, for lack of a better word. And I think that, you can read Stephen Walt in his book, Taming American Power, where he observes that it's unsurprising that other United States should be perceived with mistrust when it is the dominant power. And I think that, indeed, as long as the United States is perceived as seeking to impose its vision on others, we should expect that mistrust in a situation of a kind of disequilibrium of power in the international sphere to continue. Now, the values differences are, in some cases, they are clearly real and enduring. The use of force, which Richard also mentioned in there, is one of the things that recurs through our survey. It's kind of interesting. We ask these three values questions, and on some things, we know, for example, that Americans and Europeans overwhelmingly agree that economic power is more important than military power in the current international relations, which will surprise some people, but it's true. We know that Americans and Europeans also agree, and have over the past 6 years that we've asked this survey, that on a critical national security issue, we should act together with our closest allies, which surprises people given the image of unilateralism in the United States. But, and this is the number that just leaps out on so many folks, we asked, would you agree or disagree with the statement? Under some conditions, war is necessary to achieve justice. 70% of Americans or so agree with that statement, and only about 30% of Europeans agree. There are clearly some very real and very enduring differences about the military force and the use of force in the international arena. And I think, indeed, given that disequilibrium that exists between many European countries and the United States over military capacity, we should expect that to continue. Now, let me give you two reasons to think about why there will be a recovery. Now, I've just painted you this portrait about the use of force. But in fact, if you contrast and pull together those values questions that I talked about, preferences for economic power over military power, with the belief that war is sometimes necessary to achieve justice, you actually see that things are much more complex than that. That in fact, as I've said, a majority of Americans and Europeans can be seen, if you will, as sort of pragmatists, people who believe that economic power is more desirable than military power, and believe that there are, under some conditions, war can be just. And so I think that if you look at a more sophisticated way, those differences somewhat break down, and they break down significantly within Europe. I think that, and the differences that we see across the Atlantic are sometimes mask the fact that there are wide differences within the United States. You could say them simplistically between Democrats and Republicans, as well as in Europe, if you think about the differences between a country like the United Kingdom and Germany. Secondly, we know that there has been an improvement at the elite level. Actually, if you look at the sort of working policy level, if you were to go to Brussels and you talk to folks, the kind of estrangement and the feeling of anger that you've seen towards the Bush administration around the Iraq War, I think has largely been mended. I can give you a couple of quotes here. You listen to Javier Solana, the EU High Representative for Common Security and Policy. The situation as far as our bilateral relationship is almost perfect. What we've begun to think about is how to resolve together the many problems which are an international agenda. He said, so no more talk about problems between us. European Commission President Jose Manuel Barroso, EU-US relations have strengthened considerably over the last year, and we're working together to address common economic, political, and environmental challenges. And at that working level, it seems to me that relations are less and less about how we feel about each other, and more about how we look at global challenges. So let me really wrap up with a sense of where we go in 2008. Because, as we were pointing out in our introduction here, we've got elections ourselves coming up. And the question in a lot of ways is what will happen there? And this is the question of how enduring this is. So we asked Europeans and Americans, regardless of who's elected, after 2008, do you think relations will stay the same, improve, or get worse? And what you see is somewhat surprising. Among Europeans, the largest percentage think that relations will stay the same, 46%. Compared with Americans, from the largest percent, 42%, feel that relations will improve. Now, I have to take you one step further before I can get at the why this is, because the stay the same numbers really sort of depend on where you think things are. So we asked those people, those who said stay the same or get worse, are relations too strained to recover? And you see that, in fact, only 19% of Europeans and 11% of Americans believe that relations are too strained to recover. Either they believe that relations are stay the same, they might get worse, but they're not too strained to recover, or they will improve on overwhelming majorities on both sides of the Atlantic. For me, 19% of Europeans is higher than I'd like to see it personally, but it's not some image of us sort of having fundamentally lost our moorings and unable to reconnect. We asked folks, what's the most important factor behind the decline in relations between the United States and Europe? We asked people along the bottom, the management of the war in Iraq, which I asked deliberately, because I didn't want to ask the question about if it was the decision to go in. At this point, that feels a little bit in the past. It's where we are now. We asked, is it Guantanamo Bay? Is this issue of the U.S.'s loss of moral legitimacy in the world? Abu Ghraib, things Richard mentioned there. Is it Kyoto, the third one? Is it this sort of, we use that as the proxy for sort of the values question about the environment. Are we fundamentally different in how we think about the world? Or is it President Bush himself? And we made our respondents choose one of them to sort of confront them into a starker choice. What you see is really interesting. 38% of Americans and Europeans believe it's the management of the war in Iraq. Only 4% of Europeans and 2% of Americans, Guantanamo. A slightly larger number, 11% of Europeans, 5% of Americans, Kyoto. And 34% of Europeans and 39% of Americans think it's President Bush himself. Now, these numbers are going to get very interesting when we ask them again next year, when it's a little bit closer to the election and when it's clear who the candidates will be. But at this point, what I thought of is, if you were to say to me, what will happen in 2008? These numbers suggest to me that in the European publics, at least, a new face in the White House will get you part of the way there. It will make a difference, but it won't get you all the way there. The management of the war in Iraq will continue to endure as an issue that will challenge U.S.-European relations. And I think this is what I conclude is behind that large percentage of Europeans who believe that relations are likely to stay the same. It depends on what happens in the management of the war in Iraq. So I'd like to wrap up. It may be a little bit too early to sort of come to a conclusion, but I think that I just want to be misunderstood. I'm not suggesting here that Americans and Europeans don't have real differences. I'm not suggesting that we don't have different values on certain things. But because my concern is really not that we're identical. I think, in fact, that's not likely to happen, and I'm kind of glad about that. I think that these differences should endure. But at the same time, I think that these days, at least from a policy perspective, more and more the question is, how can we find ways to manage those differences and address global problems? Thank you.
My task was to talk about anti-Americanism in France. And the first question I wanted to ask is that even still a relevant topic today? A few years ago, obviously, such a panel would have included a discussion of France, a country where anti-Americanism is part of national identity. That's the enemy among America's allies, and a nation who has made a national hero out of a farmer who destroyed McDonald's for fun. But today, France and the U.S. are the new best friends. And that farmer who ran for president got a mere 1% of the vote. And are there many other countries whose presidents spend their summer vacation in the U.S., or whose president, when he's in town in New York for the United Nations, goes jogging in Central Park, or talk on Iran, a tougher talk than the U.S., therefore giving a break to American foreign policy and diplomacy? So is French anti-Americanism a thing of the past? The bad news is, I don't think so. The good news is, I don't think it matters. So the complex relationship of the French with the U.S. is made of older and much more profound feelings than simply the temporary negative reaction towards Bush and his failed policies in Iraq, one that could be easily reversed. What I want to argue today is that French anti-Americanism is distinctive in Europe for three reasons. The first is the length of its history. The second is the breadth of the varieties of types of anti-Americanisms which are found in France. And the third is the way it's all spread out across the political spectrum. And then I will explore how the Sarkozy presidency may indeed be changing some of this and what that means for the US. So first, let me start with the length of the history of French anti-Americanism, which I think really contributes to this perception, especially in the US, but elsewhere too, that the French are the most anti-American of all Europeans, which doesn't reflect in your surveys. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but except for a few very punctual issues, the French are never at the top of the most anti-Americans in the number. But they are in a different way. So sure, France is actually the only big European country that has never fought a war against the US. But the French distrust of America is older, is at least as old, if not older, than the country of the United States itself, because it began as an extension of the centuries-old antagonism between France and Britain at the time when France was actually an American power. And each period in a very long relationship between France and the US has seen a development of new kinds of anti-American arguments, which over time has accumulated into a vast repertoire of cliches and negative stereotypes. So for instance, in the 19th century, you had these stereotypes about the US being a materialistic and a provincial society. In the 1930s, that's when started to emerge all these cliches about the US as having an inferior mass culture. Mass culture, really inferior. During the Vietnam War, you had imperialism, etc., etc. All these arguments, which have been developed for 3 centuries, are readily available in the background of French national consciousness. And in times of crisis between France and the US, which happens every now and then, I think these old tropes bleed from the intellectual, where they are stored, if you want, to the general public. And as a result, each time there's an opportunity of criticizing the United States that could arise in France, opinion makers can go back and use these old arguments and adapt them to the current situation. I think the second distinctive feature of French anti-Americanism is the breadth of its varieties. And let me explain. Not all anti-Americanisms are born the same. In the book Anti-Americanisms in World Politics, which Peter Katzenstein and our own Bob Cohen have published last year, and to which I had the pleasure to contribute a chapter on anti-Americanism in France, we developed a typology of 6 different kinds of anti-Americanism, or different types. Usually you find that in most countries, the anti-American critiques are fairly concentrated in maybe 2, 3, sometimes 4 of these types. But what's peculiar about France is that all the possible types are present. And indeed, I had to argue with the editors of the volume to include even a 7th in the case of France, because I could find all of them. So what are they? Let me tell you briefly what they are. The first one is the one we labeled sovereignist anti-Americanism. And a frequent French critique of the US, often associated with Gaullism, going back to the times of de Gaulle, focuses on the power of the US in the international system. On the right, as on the left, many politicians have insisted on the importance of not losing control over national sovereignty, even if that means getting in the way of the US. And that anti-Americanism is really rooted in a particularly sensitive national ego in France, and maybe a national bitterness about the loss of great power status. A second type is the one we had called legacy anti-Americanism. So in the case of France, it comes from the legacy of a sometimes tense Franco-American history. Not the ones about France and the US being best friends, but what France considered the late involvement of the US in World War II, or Dien Bien Phu, or Suez, or that history, as well as from a legacy of communist influence in France during the Cold War period. So what the US did in the past, in addition to what the US is doing today, suggests that it's not a partner that can be trusted, And therefore, France needs to take national security into its own hands instead of being at the mercy of the vagaries of American foreign policy, as we saw in Iraq. And that means, for instance, building a strong, independent European foreign policy. The third type is liberal anti-Americanism. And that's the idea that America is simply not living up to its own principles, and it's demanding of others virtues that it does not uphold itself. And this is when we're talking about Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, etc. And as a result of that hypocrisy, the US is becoming a danger to the very cause it's trying to promote, whether we're talking about free trade or the environment or the Middle East. A fourth type is the elitist anti-Americanism, which really you find massively in France and not so much in other countries, driven mostly by cultural arguments instead of specific policy actions. That's the oldest and the most visible form of anti-Americanism in France, and it's a patronizing, elitist critique of America. There's a feeling of French superiority over the United States that's very well ingrained, even, and that's the irony, even by those who have wholeheartedly adopted American popular culture. Then, and that's the one I added, was the nostalgic anti-Americanism. That's, in France you find individuals from all walks of life and left and right who share negative sentiments about what they perceive American culture and society to be, believing that France used to be a better place before the United States and its fig leaf globalization transformed it, dehumanized it, and cut it off from its traditional roots. And that's true whether we're talking about the cafe on the corner, or wines, or the French language. And that's a very defensive type of anti-Americanism that calls for protectionist actions. Another one, the sixth type, I told you I have 7, is the social anti-Americanism. And that's one of the most widespread and prevalent denunciations of America in France that focuses on the social values that we were just discussing. It's a social critique which, for the French, has 3 main components. First, America is fundamentally an unequal society, unjust society. Second, it's a violent and a hypocritical society, whether you're talking about abortion or guns or death penalty. And finally, and that's very important for the French, the US is an excessively religious society, which in a way leads me to the last one, which is again quite different from the others, and it's the radical Muslim anti-Americanism, the most recent type that comes from some religiously radicalized French Muslims who partake in that clash of civilizations idea and believe that the US is really involved in a crusade against Muslims, whether it's in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or in Palestine. And of all the anti-Americanisms found in France, the only one that calls for actual violence against people. So now the third factor, which explains why French anti-Americanism stands out in Europe, is political. And what's peculiar about France is how, for the past 3 decades at least, anti-Americanism has been spread out all across the political spectrum. Whereas in most other countries, you usually have some anti-American parties and some pro-American parties. So obviously, there was an anti-Americanism of the far left, of course, a remnant of communism and the Cold War. And there's an anti-Americanism of the far right, one that's based mostly on nostalgia and fears about national identity and sovereignty. There's also an anti-Americanism of the moderates, of the socialist left, which is mostly based on social issues and disagreements related to globalization. But what's really specific about France is you have also an anti-Americanism of the moderate right, mostly the heritage of Gaullism. It has historical roots. But it's there, and then there's been some past dependency. So anti-Americanism has been able to endure in France because the costs which were associated with using anti-American rhetoric have been much smaller than the benefits that are derived from it. It's very costless in France, or at least was until very recently, to be anti-American because everybody is. So if you are going to say something anti-American, it cannot be held against you by your opponent, and you're going to lose the election because of that. And I think that's a big difference with many other European countries. French politicians have few incentives to defend the US or to criticize people who are anti-American. And at the same time, and that's what I'm doing in the book that I'm currently writing on the topic, I look at the political uses of anti-Americanism, and I look specifically at how it can be mobilized as a political resource to support different types of policy agenda. Which now brings me to our new president, or my new Nicolas Sarkozy, and the very visible inflection of the new French administration on everything American, not only foreign policy. So far, Sarkozy the American, as he's called, has kept true to his reputation. He has tried to operate a foreign policy rapprochement with the US directly, personally, not necessarily through the usual diplomatic channels, as evidenced, again, well-publicized American vacation. And sure, he was criticized for it. But what I found interesting in all episodes was that he seemed to have been more criticized domestically for the price tag of his house and for the fact that the tab had been picked up by some corporate people than, bizarrely, for the fact that he was going to the US in the first place. The new position of the French administration on Iran, as well as the hints that it may want to reintegrate NATO fully and might want to help out in Iraq, are clear signs that French foreign policy is not motivated right now by anti-Americanism. And for now, Sarkozy's overtures and very activist policy towards the US has not been too heavily criticized at home, certainly less than one would have expected, given the history of France again. So I think part of this and that's what I found the most puzzling. So part of this may be due to the fact that we are now at a very particular historical juncture, and now seems a logical time for rapprochement. On the one hand, you have President Bush, who's seriously weakened, both domestically and internationally, is on the way out, and is considered a lame duck president. The US being less strong and credible, it might be a very opportune time for French diplomacy to step in. And on the other hand, you have President Sarkozy, who is on the way in or on the way up, with both his domestic opposition and the international community really giving him the benefit of the doubt and an incredibly long honeymoon period since he was elected in early May. Of course, that particularly favorable historical juncture can change. First of all, if Sarkozy stops being perceived as successful at home, which might happen sooner than later, and if new momentum emerges in the US with the election next year. But part of this may also be due to the fact that Sarkozy may have tapped into a new generation, the 30-somethings, for whom the US represents social, economic dynamism, and for whom all these American social woes, poverty, death penalty, religion, etc., are less important than they were for their elders, especially the 68 generation. So I think we need more polling on that. This attempted rehabilitation of the US in the French collective psyche, I think, goes way beyond foreign policy, and it's deeply fundamentally about domestic politics as well. For Sarkozy, you all know that story, the immigrant and the non-graduate of the French elite schools, the best thing about the US are the can-do attitude, the hope of social promotion, work, and praise of success. So he really, really believes in that. And by reconciling France and the US in foreign policy, I think he's also trying, although it's less visible, to reconcile the French with the idea that there are indeed some aspects of American public policy, not foreign policy, public policy, which may be well worth importing. Whether we're talking about affirmative action or reform of the justice system, multiculturalism, which is really a taboo word in France, or right now the administrative spoil system, Sarkozy is really trying to operate a serious revolution in French policymaking and thinking. And that's the one, to show that the fact that a policy is American in origin does not discredit it per se. So that's brand new. So I think all of that should bode well for the US, in part for America, right? Well, maybe I shouldn't have. I think all this should bode well, right? Maybe no, maybe not. I wouldn't be so positive because I'm not sure there is such a direct link, such a strong link after all, between what the state of anti-American or pro-American feelings is in France and then an anti-American or pro-American French foreign policy. It's not even clear that French anti-Americanism has any impact at all on the US and ever had such an impact. So take the Iraq case, for instance, which has been portrayed in the media, especially in the US media, as the case par excellence of a foreign policy that's really motivated and driven by anti-Americanism. I think as soon as you start to look at this argument at a closer scrutiny, you find that just it doesn't hold. Anti-Americanism was secondary in guiding French foreign policy in that case. Instead, there are lots of reasons for why the French took the position that they took on Iraq. Mostly a different comprehension of the situation, different assessment, and a different understanding of what would best defend the national interest. But it was not necessarily because of anti-Americanism. Actually, what I argue in that chapter and in the book is it's not at all because of anti-Americanism, although it did trigger some anti-Americanism, but that's a different story. And interestingly, only a fraction of very tiny fraction of French foreign policy actions in the past decade appear confrontational towards the US. Even when the French were embroiled in that very bitter dispute with the US over Iraq, simultaneously, they were cooperating on Afghanistan, they were cooperating in Lebanon, they were cooperating on all counterterrorism issues. Actually, it's you, Bob, who was telling me at the time I was doing this research that Franco-American cooperation on intelligence and counterterrorism had never been better than in the months and years that surrounded and followed the Franco-American debacle over Iraq. So overall, I think this background, French anti-Americanism, has not produced openly confrontational policies contrary to what's commonly believed, and neither has it produced stronger support for closer, deeper European integration in foreign policy, which could have enabled France to stand up to the US more effectively when needed. That's really what the French wanted. And it seems to be what the French want when we look at your surveys. But as a very divisive debate on the referendum on the European Constitution in 2005 really showed, anti-Americanism did not seem to be weighing much or at all in the French assessment of where Europe should go. So I'm not sure that the current favorable predispositions of the Sarkozy administration to the US will make much difference either, one way or another. Final note to conclude, maybe on a lighter note, if I may. If there's one thing that approaches national character in France, I think it's that the French are simply anti. Sure, they're anti-American, but they're also anti a lot of things. They're anti-Europe. They're anti-immigrants. They're anti their bosses. They're anti their own governments, which they overturn with each election. So my final piece of advice to the Americans in the audience would be just to not take it too personal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. These were three marvelous presentations. I'm going to just sum up very briefly and then open the floor to Q&A. One of the fundamental things that came out of all three presentations is that the lines of causation are not simple. It's not the case that deep-seated anti-American attitudes produced policy differences. It's not the case that differences over policy or personalities produced anti-Americanism. It's also not the case that some exogenous factors, some third factors, such as the end of the Cold War, the advent of a more united Europe, caused both anti-Americanism and a breakdown in policies. The lines are much more complicated than that. This shouldn't be surprising. I'll put it in terms that maybe students can relate to. If you're in a relationship and you have a policy difference with your significant other, that is, some action that this other person took that you disagree with, suddenly your basic attitudes begin to shift. You think, why did I like this person in the first place? There must be many other things. I actually don't like the way she parts her hair, come to think of it. Those sets of attitudes then produce differences over some other set of policies. And maybe some environmental factors, such as this exam week, where you just got 2 letters of rejection from law schools, creates new pressures. This is a simple example, but it really operates this way in international life. These things don't operate according to linear lines of causality. So let me just touch on a couple of policy ideas that I could tease out of these sets of considerations. First, the environmental issues that I think all three speakers touched on. There are some structural changes that have occurred in the international environment that are related to these issues. The end of the Cold War, the loss of the external threat that kept the Allies together, the advent of a more cohesive, united Europe, with an ambitious agenda and new members and new preoccupations. The forces of globalization, the rise of new, or the return of new major global actors that has changed the international environment. Putting this in policy terms, it may seem that this is just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about those factors. We just have to live with them. But there actually are some policy implications because the international institutions and patterns of behavior that we developed during the Cold War are not as relevant for these new phenomena as they were for the old world that we left behind. The World Trade Organization is experiencing stresses and strains. The Doha round is not back on track. It means that the opportunities for U.S.-European differences over trade policy are increasing. That ought to be fixed. We've missed, probably missed for good, an opportunity for reform of the UN system. It's still possible, but the last 2 or 3 years were the best chance we've had in a long time, and we let that go by. There's still time, there's still a need to transform the relationships between the two principal European and transatlantic institutions, the EU and NATO, which have yet to work out sort of to fashion a new workable relationship between them. There is no place that Europeans and Americans can go all together to talk about big strategic issues. It doesn't happen in NATO because NATO's agenda is confined by the French and others. It doesn't happen in the US-EU dialogue because that's too episodic and thin. So there's actually some things that can be done about these big structural issues. Next, in the policies, I'll just mention two that came out of this, Iraq and the so-called war on terror. It seems to me, taking the latter first, it seems to me that if Americans, for understandable reasons, may have overreacted to 9/11 and put in place an over-militarized response, the Europeans may have underreacted in saying, we've seen all this before. We've been victims of terrorism on our own soil. This is nothing new. I think both sides are now moving toward a place closer together, not converging yet. There is a need for strategic convergence because the differences were really quite alarming on this score, the polling data on how the two sides see cooperation and terrorism. Good operational coordination is helpful, but it's not enough. There needs strategic convergence. Iraq, I think we, the United States, are moving in a different, of necessity, moving toward a different place. The visit of French Foreign Minister Kouchner to Iraq was enormously helpful. Not that he will agree with the United States on Iraq policy, he probably won't, but the fact that the French see it in their own interest to be back in the game, we would hope followed by the Germans at some point. This could then be the beginnings of fashioning some sort of U.S.-European approach toward Iraq, despite all that's gone on before. The final point I'll make, very briefly, is attitudes. There are attitudes that are bubbling around that are influenced by policies, influenced by the environment, but they are a source for worry. And on our side, I think we Americans have done a very poor job of public diplomacy. We used to do it, at least in some senses, all right during the Cold War because we had a focus for those efforts. Those efforts really evaporated after the end of the Cold War. USIA was abolished, put under the State Department, where it disappeared almost without a trace. Funding for development aid and other aspects of soft power also diminished. When I was giving a series of speeches a few months ago in Germany, going out to small cities, Chemnitz in former East Germany, was revealing. Speaking to a group of students, about 400 of them, in the Q&A it occurred to me that these students had known no other United States than that led by George W. Bush. They had a certain image of the United States that was associated with assertive unilateralism, unconcern for the attitudes of others and the policies of others, which was quite different from the German attitudes I experienced during the period of German unification, when we were seen as on the right side of these issues. So there's a lot of work, and we need to get back to learning how to do cultural diplomacy, which entails a willingness to listen as well as to be heard. So that went on longer than I meant, so I will now stop and open it to your questions. Nate.
I see sort of a tension between some of the data presented by Richard and the general conclusions drawn by John, in particular with regards to unfavorability of Americans as a people. And it would seem, it's a tension, it might be a false tension, but it would seem that that unfavorability of Americans is actually in line with unfavorability of U.S. policy, because it declined similarly. So is it that Europeans, in the data you presented, or people in general, equate Americans as a people with their foreign policy, or with some of the policy of the United States government? That would be one question. And then this would also, I guess, suggest something you were just talking about public diplomacy and the failures of public diplomacy, and that even if you see a decline in anti-Americanism, or decline in foreign favorability to U.S. policy, you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a fall in favorability of Americans as a people if there are these structures in place to bolster public diplomacy efforts. But I would be interested in your views on that issue.
You know, I think that the data on attitudes towards the American people shows a couple of things. I mean, one is that there still is this real gap between views of the country, views of foreign policy, the views of President Bush, and views of the American people. I mean, you still get, especially in Europe, higher ratings for the American people. So there is a real distinction there. At the same time, you do see some of the same trend lines, which to me suggests that these negative views about foreign policy are starting to, drag down views of the American people a little bit. But there's still a big gap there. There's still, people are distinguishing between the American people and the policy of the United States. But there's some evidence that it's starting to drag a bit on views of the American people as well.
I may add something just in the case of France, the data I had looked at going back even further, before 2000. There used to be a very big gap, more than 30%, I think, between the favorability towards American policies and towards the Americans themselves. The gap has been narrowing and narrowed down sharply after the 2004 re-election of President Bush. Because up until then, people were saying, giving them benefit of the doubt. They never elected Bush in the first place anyway.
Right.
It's all a fluke and blah, blah, blah. But after 2004, they said, well, if they re-elect him when they had the choice this time, then they really must be thinking along the same line as the policy. They really must be approving that. I know that this for France, the gap really closed. I mean, not closed, but really became much smaller then.
Maybe I can say a word about public diplomacy, because I think that it's probably the most common response that people talk about when they talk about dealing with the image, changing the image of the United States. I always find it helpful to separate out two very different things that are meant by public diplomacy. The first is what I think you're referring to when you talk about USIA, the sort of U.S. Information Agency, and the tradition under the Cold War of sending American writers abroad who would read, and so as American literature was perceived popularly, jazz musicians went abroad, and Louis Armstrong was an ambassador to the United States, and there were the American libraries in most major cities around Europe that Europeans could go to read American magazines and books. And indeed, this has largely dried up and disappeared. And so one of those remedies, which is often very closely tied through visa policy that we have currently with the war on terror, is how do we get more cultural exchange going again? Complications that we have around visa policy. But there's another form by which that's meant that sometimes I think really just must be distinguished. I think they can be both thought of as public diplomacy, but the other has to do with the criticisms of unilateralism. So the idea is that the way that America conducts policies matters, that it does so in a way that appears to show disregard for other nations' interests, it does so in a way that is not sophisticated, it does so in a way that sort of is arrogant, if you will. And I think that that's a very different thing. In many ways, that's the emphasis, if you will, on the diplomacy side of that equation. But I always think that on this issue, I'm reminded of Robert Kagan. Many of you might know of Paradise and Power, which was sort of this book that set out in many ways the argument, really got the phrase right. Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus. That's all you have to say, and everybody gets it. Yet, if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to take a look at the paperback edition. because it sparked enormous controversy and is a new introduction in the paperback edition. You should Xerox it if you haven't read it or something, because it's witchy in where he says, all the things I say are true about the differences over the use of force, but the thing that I didn't mention, and that I really discounted, that I need to, was legitimacy. And that was the issue of how the United States conducted its policies. And I think that in many ways, the second Bush administration sought to change that with its so-called charm offensive in Europe. They sent Condoleezza Rice to Paris and had her in the heart of the beast, as they said at the time. And she got up there and she said, in fact, our common values are more important than our differences. President Bush went to Europe 4 times in the first 6 months of that. And in my mind, this is a significant part behind the many of what I talk about, relations at the official level. Because I don't think we see that sort of gap. But the gap between the official level and the public level is still to be changed.
Yes, sir.
There is over or these attitudes towards the economic sphere. For example, because I have a certain attitude towards
I can't resist answering your question, sir, because I just finished writing a paper with one of my Princeton colleagues, Christina Davis, which is called Business as Usual, Economic Responses to Political Tensions, and in which we compare 2 cases, which are the US and France after Iraq, and China and Japan after the Koizumi administration, visit to the shrine, etc. But anyway, what we find in the transatlantic case, but we find exactly the same one in the Japan-China case, is that there's no spillover whatsoever. I mean, there were calls for boycotts on both sides of the Atlantic. O'Reilly in the US led the charge and invented the whole Boycott France campaign, which, by the way, he officially lifted on May 7th of this year, the day after the election of Sarkozy.
Vive la France.
We'll boycott all these American products. And the business community was genuinely worried. I mean, there's these big groups, speaking of public diplomacy, Business for Diplomatic Action, for instance, which was very worried about the consequences that it might have. So you find a couple tiny instances in which it had a very short-lived impact. In the case of Franco-American commerce, it was on French wines, and it lasted for about 6 weeks. And after 6 months, it was completely back to normal. And the other area where you find some impact is in the travel and tourism industry. But again, it was pretty short-lived. For anything else, what we find in our data is actually that trade and investment between France and the US was better after 2003 than before, but was also growing at a faster pace than trade and investment between the US and the UK, or trade, the US and Spain, which were in the coalition of the willing.
Real quick, there's a really great scholar who does work about globalization in France. Her name is Sophie Meunier. And her book about globalization I want to recommend to you because it talks about the rhetoric of anti-globalization in France, contrary to an American model, and yet observes, if I have understood it correctly, just how globalized so many French companies are as they see in their actions to benefit from and engage with. And I think it sounds like in many ways you could be misled by whether it's an anti-freedom prize argument.
I'm sorry to monopolize the conversation, but that's exactly the main reason why, is that trade between France and the US is almost nothing compared to the rest of the relationship between France and the US. And most of the trade actually does occur within companies, which just happen to have one foot on each side of the Atlantic. And that's why it really didn't matter whether people would boycott or not, because it was mainly occurring within the same family, within the same company.
Just one more sentence. The truly shocking thing for me about Sarkozy is not that he said he wants to mend relations and work together in the international sphere with the United States. Chirac said that when he was elected. That's about a kind of common vision I think of the United as having international responsibilities. The truly shocking thing was his praise of the American economic model. That was unheard of and unimaginable.
Axel, and we'll come down here.
My question was, now the transatlantic trends survey seems to show that about 40% of Europeans associated the negative image of the U.S. with President Bush. And I'd assume it's similar in France. And I was wondering Sarkozy, in his attempt to mend relations with the U.S., seems to be doing it both on a personal level with President Bush and on a more general level, I guess. And would you say that that's a mistake, given the fact that Bush is on his way out and not popular at all in France and Europe? And secondly, how do you think the American election in 2008 is going to impact Franco-American relations and European-American relations in general? And how's America's choice going to be perceived on the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, let me start maybe with the second question. I'm afraid there might be some disappointment because the French, as I think most of the other Europeans, have such high hopes right now for a change. I mean, they had very high hopes in 2004. Kerry was the French president. But the Europeans really, really deeply believed...
French.
Had French ties. and family ties. But they really thought in 2004, and they're very hopeful this time. And their hopes are so high that I think there's no way that they won't be disappointed at some point. They also have some false impressions of where people stand and what their policy positions are. Like they assume, I think the majority of French people just assume that the Democrats are all for immediate withdrawal and working in a multilateral framework, whereas the Republicans think the other way. So I think the election will help a lot because people will, again, give the benefit of the doubt to the new president and start anew, put the counter back to zero or something. But I'm not sure it's going to last a long time. Now, your first question of whether Sarkozy is making a mistake or not. As I said in my talk, I think it's a particular historical juncture. So in a way, he's right to be trying to do the rapprochement, not necessarily become an Atlanticist and becoming more American than the Americans. But I think that rapprochement had started. Was almost done. Before he arrived to power, certainly at the diplomacy level, things were completely back to normal. Now I'm not sure how long he'll be able to keep up with that. And I think a lot will depend on what he's able to do domestically in areas that have nothing to do with the US. But I think as long as he's safe domestically, he can push a little bit further on the US. But as soon as he's going to have to face massive demonstrations and political crisis, he may put the brakes on that because that's too easy a target. I don't think the French people have moved as fast as he has on that issue. And certainly not on Iran. On Iran, certainly the French people are not at all behind the rhetoric of both the president from the right and the socialist foreign minister.
I was just going to add briefly that I agree with you that there's a real possibility that people could be setting themselves up for disappointment to some extent. There's a lot of talk, I think, particularly about Hillary and Obama, and a lot of excitement in Europe right now. But as I mentioned in my talk, I think there's some long-term sort of issues about the environment or about resentment of American power, Americanization. There are some things that are going to endure no matter who's president, and that's going to create potential for tensions regardless of who you get in the White House in 2009.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I have a short question about Sarkozy. How much the French follow him? It seems that even his wife has some disagreement. And then I have some comment about the situation in Italy, which is kind of relevant for this. Italy, for many things, is similar to France, the variety of anti-Americanism, particularly in the educated classes. Italy, however, has a much more servile political class at the top. There are certain questions we cannot even discuss. The Americans put an atomic bomb basis in Sardinia. Nobody knows when was decided, who decided, is there, and cannot be discussed. At the level of common people, there was a lot of sympathy in America because they were lucky to always have bad adversaries like Stalin and for before things. But America had such an attitude so arrogant at the common level that, for example, they kidnapped foreign citizens. This attitude hurt the national pride. They kidnapped foreign citizens in Italy. American soldiers commit crime and they cannot be prosecuted in Italy. They are prosecuted here and restored. So these are kind of things that make it even at the level of common people, the American kind of, I don't say hated, but not really appreciated. About the improvement, I'm afraid there will be an improvement. in the anti-Americanism will decrease, but not a positive thing. And Europe, at least Italy and France, seem to be sliding toward fascism. Berlusconi, Sarkozy are a typical example, and they are getting more and more support, at least in Italy. The last poll, Berlusconi is 50. It's worth visiting, you know? So many Italians, particularly in the north, the rich, they see sliding toward fascism, they appreciate certain things of
Anybody want to react to that? Okay. Yes. I think we should have one more question. You get the last.
A new piece of gossip that just came out an hour ago with you after Sarkozy. Really funny one.
Okay. Last question so we don't exploit our panelists too much.
I just wanted to pick up on what you said at the end about the war on terror and our approach in the war on terror, which I think is incredibly important. And I was surprised that you said that you thought in Europe the sensation was that the US had overreacted. In Spain, at least, I think the sensation was that the US had made the war on terror worse. I'm not saying that I think that's true. I just think there was certainly a feeling around the March bombings in Madrid that was the case. That the March bombings had been created, had to happen in part because of the exacerbation of tensions due to US policy in the Middle East. And I kind of wanted to tie this in with what you were saying about how that one question about values, that what was it, is war sometimes necessary to achieve justice, and how that was something that people disagreed on. And I think that's a big value tension. And so how do we reconcile that tension on values, that whether a just war is possible, with a common policy on terrorism?
Let me start for this. I don't think I'm in disagreement. What I meant by that was that I think in retrospect, and I said for understandable reasons, we're very close to where the Twin Towers used to stand. The United States was so shocked by the first attack on our soil, not counting Pearl Harbor, which wasn't the territorial United States since the War of 1812, that there was this deep, visceral set of fears and desire to be safe again that led to, a set of overreactions. At least you could say that now 6 years after 9/11, and we're now beginning to pull back to a way of dealing with this challenge that reckons with the fact that we are going to have to be living with a certain degree of fear, as Europeans and most of the rest of the world has for most of their history. So the Spaniards and others did feel, I'm not sure they can really make the case, that the attacks on their own soil was somehow related to the American overreaction, or at least the American action in Iraq. On the question of the use of force, one policy remedy for this would be to seek to develop a U.S.-European set of principles on the use of force. Now, I've been around this block several times already, because there's been about 5, 6 efforts, starting with Colin Powell, to define on the American side when it's justifiable to use force. None of them are very satisfactory. It might be worth the effort to try to use that device to try to bring states in Europe a little closer together on at least declaratory policy, which might help. John?
You ask a really interesting question that has at least 3 parts I'd like to dwell on quickly. The first is a matter of language, and that's the use of the word war. In the United States, back in the 60s, we had a war on poverty. We didn't think it was a bad thing. We weren't worried about soldiers going in to kill poor people or something like that. It's a rhetorical device that we, I think, are more comfortable with in the United States. We talk about a war on drugs. We talk about all this sort of stuff. And it's a political trope that is used in a way that I think resonates differently in Europe than it does here. But I'm often I'm not satisfied with the idea that Europeans have more experience with terrorism than Americans do. Basque aside, IRA aside, I always want to remind people that we had Oklahoma City in 1996. And I think that what we saw in 2001 was distinct because it had to do with what we thought of as international terrorism. And I think that that's a meaningful difference in my mind. And I think that I know that many Europeans like to make this argument with us and say that, no, but I'll never forget a German colleague of mine coming to New York where I was living in after 2001 saying, we Europeans, we're more blasé about terrorism. And the whole room looked at her, staggered, and somebody sort of muttered, well, maybe you should be a little more concerned, was about the best they could say. So I'm not so sure that our differences on terrorism are quite as great around that. But the issue of war comes up repeatedly in terms of how we talk about it, because the President Bush says we have to fight the terrorists abroad so they don't attack us at home. That's a very different solution than a solution in which the United States and Europe are in fact cooperating quite closely on, which is better intelligence. It's a very different approach to it. So that's one part that I want to talk about. I want to contrast Spain and Germany to talk a little bit about how we've thought about that, because I think there was no doubt in anyone's mind that the Madrid bombings were portrayed and understood as a result, I think, not of American policies, but of Aznar's policies. And they were about him going into Iraq. And they were punishment, retribution for him for doing that. But I think what's most interesting now that we have a couple of more years on that is what's happened in Germany. Germany had a debate for a long time in which they talked about themselves as being an island. We didn't go into Iraq, so we weren't vulnerable to that. And the discovery of these unexploded bombs on the train systems last summer in Germany, and then the foiled plot in August that they saw, has been really something of a psychological earthquake in Germany. And the German Interior Minister, Schäuble, has been the largest, loudest voice on this as he says, Germany is part of the international, what he calls, Islamist threat. You know, it doesn't matter that we didn't go into Iraq. And lastly, all I have to say, when it comes to thinking about those differences, about a war on terror, the thing that I'm occasionally most dispirited by is the not separating between Afghanistan and Iraq. Because it just really seems to me that right after 2001, in 2002, we had a common perception of a threat. We went through the United Nations Security Council. We agreed on an action together to deal with Afghanistan together. Then there was another decision that was made about going into Iraq. But the fact that they're both in the Middle East and the fact that they're both suffering from such continued violence and instability has often led, I think, in European minds to just sort of think about this as this American mess in the Middle East. And I worry most about the lack of commitment and lack of cooperation on Afghanistan right now, and what that means for NATO, and what that means for a kind of clarity with which we think about the common challenges that we're facing today.
We obviously could go on for quite a bit longer, but we won't. Thank you to our panelists and to you. I want to thank our three panelists. This is just terrific. Thank you very much.